Thank you all for coming. It's my pleasure to be in the interviewing chair this time, especially with a text that I found incredibly interesting. This is for the series Analyzing Texts, an analysis assessment of the poetry of Thomas Hardy. Now, I come to Thomas Hardy, as I assume many people do, through his novels, and in particular, I hope you don't mind saying, one of the most disturbing passages in any novel I have ever encountered in Jude the Obscure, which I, know is pretty much par for the course, right? I'm not going to describe the scene for you. I recommend you do read the novel, however. That is to say that Hardy is known primarily for his work as a novelist, and so it was a great discovery for me to be able to encounter a text that really brought to life probably what is arguably the maybe even more exceptional work of Hardy. And so I'm happy to be able to talk about that with you today. So I wonder, just to get started, if you could give a little bit of a background on the sort of arc, particularly the kind of relationship between the prose and poetry of Hardy, because I know that there's an interesting kind of background there.
So Hardy, he started actually his career as an architect. He was trained as an architect, and he enjoyed it, but was always writing on the side. And he moved, he lived in west of England, in Dorset, and moved to London for a short time to work as an architect, and pretty much felt as soon as he got to London that wasn't the place for him, and was looking for an opportunity to go back to the country. And he had the opportunity to go back and to work on some churches as an architect, but was writing in the meantime, and wrote eventually 14 novels, most of which were serialized, as many novels were in this period, that is, published in chapters in magazines, serial publications, and became quite popular as a novelist. And you probably know a bunch of his novels. You mentioned Jude the Obscure, but of course he's known for The Return of the Native, and Tess of the D'Urbervilles, and The Mayor of Casterbridge, and lots of others. And through that time he was also writing poetry, but not publishing it, and said on a number of occasions that he really wanted to be known as a poet, not a novelist. And as it turns out, he's really much more known as a novelist than a poet. But when he became sufficiently successful, and that was after writing Jude the Obscure, which was the last of his major novels, he was also unhappy with how it was received, and had made enough money to be pretty comfortable, and so retired to the house he designed for himself and his wife, Maxgate, and just wrote poems for the rest of his career. And that's about 1,000, a little bit more than 1,000 poems. So 14 novels, more than 1,000 poems, also an extremely long and difficult theater piece. It was never performed. It was never really meant to be performed, called The Dynasts. So he had that, and a collection of short stories called Wessex Tales, so really quite a lot. But he moved from the novels into the poems and never went back, and spent the rest of his career as a poet.
Right.
But still was always better known for the novels. That doesn't seem to have been what he wanted for himself.
Right. Now, so a couple of questions I want to sort of link to understanding the book as a book, and how you've chosen to assemble it and the way it works, because it has actually an interesting format. Number one, I guess, first of all, what drew you to Hardy? What was this sort of impetus to come and engage with your previous work is on Philip Larkin,
right?
So what is it about Hardy? And number one, and number two, it's kind of linked to the question, is the book is designed for a specific purpose, and I just wondered if you might sort of outline what that is.
So my first book was on Larkin, as you say, and one of the things that's interesting about Larkin is how often he invokes Hardy as his primary influence. So I have an article actually that's under consideration right now about why Larkin might actually refer to Hardy as often as he does. Most poets want to be seen as original and unique, and in fact Larkin constantly said, "I'm just like Hardy," which is a weird thing for a poet to say. So I think that's sort of interesting, and after having worked on Larkin for about 5 or 6 years, and continuously coming across these passages where he really plays up the connection that he has to Hardy, and says in literally every interview, well, as you know, I'm very much like Hardy, like sort of just as a one-off, like to everyone he speaks to in any kind of published or radio context. So I thought, it would be interesting actually to go back a step. Maybe the logic would have been to write about Hardy first and then follow up with Larkin, but I had already worked on Larkin, and I thought it's sort of interesting to go back and say, what's Hardy doing that has been brought forward into Larkin? So I see a lot of connection between them. And then the book is part of a series. Palgrave, the publisher, also published my first book, but that was in a different section of the publishing company, in the monograph section. And I had been very interested in this series. I had used, there's a Frankenstein volume that I'd used in teaching, and from the same Analyzing Text series, and there's a Larkin volume that I think actually is one of the smartest books written about Larkin. But what's interesting about it is that it's very much for generalists. Right. It's not a specialized book for scholars in the same way that I think a lot of work that professors do. A lot of books that we publish are meant to be read by other professors. And that was what my first book was. And I just love the idea of a book that says everybody can read this stuff. Right. Poetry doesn't have to only be for specialists, and it doesn't have to only be for class. And this series, I think, really works to make poetry especially accessible. And so I was thinking about working on Hardy, and I was also thinking, after working on Larkin, and for those of you who know Larkin, he's considered a little bit depressive too, like Hardy is. And so I thought, wouldn't it be nice to work on someone really happy? So I wrote to Palgrave, to the other editors of this edition, and said I was thinking maybe I could write a book about Gerard Manley Hopkins, who's a pretty happy poet, as poets go. And they said, no, but we'd love a book on Hardy. So I thought, okay, I guess it's all pointing in that direction. And so I put together a proposal, and what I especially like about this series is it actually starts with the text.
Right.
It doesn't start with the background. You jump right into the themes of the poems and what the poems are doing, and close readings of the poems. And I think that that's a great way to start, actually. A lot of times when we approach poetry, I think we often maybe feel, if it's a foreign genre to us, I need to read about the poet and learn some more about the context. And I really like here that you actually start with the poems, and it makes them feel like they're doable. And then the second part of the book is actually some of the context and the biography and some of those other things. But I really love that people are asked to approach the poetry before they get to that contextual matter.
Well, I agree. To me, that was something I'd never seen before. I mean, I'm not familiar with the series. Yeah. And encountering the work first, and then sort of refracting it through the biography afterwards, and then the critical response on top of that gives you an entirely different kind of appreciation for the work itself. I have to say that turned me on to the work right before I even knew the details.
That was the idea. And that is really what I like about the series. I think it does that well.
So I wanted to just sort of delve into the meat of the book a little bit itself by picking up on, one of the themes that certainly is most striking to any reader of Hardy or anybody who's encountered representation of Hardy in film is some dark stuff, right? I mean, there's some real, I would call it almost a kind of naturalistic, sort of, pessimism is a term you use a lot, and
I use it to reject it a little bit.
Right, sure. No, so that's exactly what I wanted to jump into is this. It would be very easy to walk away, as indeed I did. My first encounter with Hardy, I walk away and just be fairly depressed. That it seems to be showing a rather dismal kind of view of the human condition, and I felt that you dealt with that really beautifully in kind of as a thread that kind of runs through thinking about the poems themselves, about Hardy as a poet, and about critical reception to because the critics, sadly, don't show a great deal of probity in their thinking about this issue in some cases. They jump to the pessimism. And so I wonder if you could sort of bring out what exactly is the feeling that his voice brings to this work. That's a very tough question.
It's a great question, yeah. Well, one of the things is, and I think it's important to remember, that he's a poet, not a philosopher. And so he's not trying to necessarily create one unified philosophy about how to approach the world. I think he's kind of throwing different stuff out there to see what sticks. And it changes over time. So he'll try something in one poem and then try something else in another one. The one constant, I would say, that extends through the poetry and probably through the novels as well, is the sense that the world is permanently tilted toward the negative. right? And so that's where people get this pessimistic, depressive idea. But Hardy actually didn't see it that way exactly. He, I think, saw it as realism, and felt that most of us were kind of delusional. And there's a level on which that, after I spent a lot of time with him, that kind of spoke to me. Like, yeah, it's true. We're all going to die. So Hardy's facing that kind of on a constant, daily, moment-to-moment basis. He seemed to feel was an encounter with truth that, unfortunately for him, most people aren't willing to encounter. Now, maybe most of us, if we thought about it, it's there, but it being our own mortality. But we don't want to think about it all the time. And he has one interesting poem that's actually probably the cheeriest of his poems, called On a Fine Morning, when he talks about ways to go through life not constantly thinking about one's own mortality. And the way to do that, he says, is to not actually look at things head on. Just look at the edges of stuff and you'll see a gleam that makes you think that maybe everything's okay. And it's the only poem that offers any hope at all. And it basically says that the reason that the hope is there is that you're lying to yourself. Right? So, yeah, there's something sort of depressive about that. But, well, I'll say for one thing, it didn't get me down.
Right.
Because I kind of like that idea of facing one's mortality and trying to, it's not fighting it exactly, but acknowledging it in every situation. And recognizing, for instance, in all his love poems, that there's always an end of love. Right? And so those kind of sappy love poems that say our love will live on forever and stuff, Hardy has no patience for that. Like, no, it won't. One of us is going to die. Right? I don't think I'm selling this well. But there's something, I think there's something refreshing about someone who's willing to face that at every moment. You may not want to live that, but there's something refreshing about a poet who's willing to face that. So I think he does a lot of that, but also it's not consistent. There is sort of a range, and I think a lot of what he's doing is sort of trying out different philosophies. And the thing for me that is implicit in every one of the poems, even the sort of darkest of them, is the idea that there is a hope, right? And so I think that that's part of what's built into it. And I think you see the hope on a couple levels. One is that he often talks about it, like, I wish that it were not so, and what can we do about that? And what is sort of the human condition that we're stuck in a situation that we may not be able to figure a way out of, but we can think about it, right? And we can try to do things with the time that we have, and and so there's a kind of hopefulness in that. And also, I think, in the impulse to write about it all the time, I find something very meaningful there. Because if you're really despairing, I'm not sure that your first impulse is creation. And that's what he's doing. So he's taking the poetry as a way to express the concerns he has, to share them, to reach out to others. And all of that feels sort of inherently hopeful to me. So even though the topics are often very dark, the fact that they exist, and they don't just exist, but they exist in extremely beautiful verse, right? And the aesthetics of that suggest that there is something worth doing here, and that it's not all bleak, and we don't just sit around despairing, because he's writing stuff, and it's gorgeous. Right, so I think there's that.
Well, I have to admit that the idea of despair, from the perspective of the author, the poet, despair isn't what comes to mind. Observation of despair, perhaps, right? I mean, he has a kind of eye, a fatalistic eye, and I don't mean that in a negative frame, but in a kind of Zen way, that's just sort of seeing things as they are and how they unfold, and observing it and deriving what one can on a kind of simple philosophical level. Certainly there's a philosophical component to it.
Absolutely, yeah. I guess when I say he's not a philosopher, what I really mean is it's not a consistent philosophy that he develops over time. He's an artist, and so there's sort of experimenting with a variety of possibilities.
Well, related to that, one of the things that I found really interesting that you kind of bring out, actually one of the things, this connection between his, I'm using the term fatalistic, and you can reject it if you. It's not a great term, but and what it means, the beyond, what death is, what the divine, what God is, where does this work? And I mean, I want to jump to another question after you talk about this to connect it to a kind of modern sensibility, that there's a certain a turn I sensed in his perception of these questions that really sets him apart from his early contemporaries.
From the Victorians.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Right. He has really interesting ideas about what happens after death, and there are a lot of poems with ghosts. In fact, there's a whole chapter in here about ghosts. Right. And he has a lot of ghost characters inhabiting his poems. And so one of the things that's interesting about him is this idea of love continuing after death, and of life continuing after death in certain ways, which maybe doesn't go along with what you're calling this fatalistic nature. It feels like it doesn't fit in a way. But he has many love poems in which the love is as strong as ever it was, but one of them is dead. Right. But they still speak to each other, and the only problem is this sort of difference in states of being.
Yeah.
But the idea that things continue after death, I mean, that's a real, I think, a point of faith in many of the poems. And his attitude toward God. Chesky's here. Chesky helped me with the chapter on God, actually.
Oh, really?
And I had a bunch of students who helped me work on this, which was great. And his attitudes for God range from completely skeptical, right? There is no controlling being. Everything is total chance. It's all happenstance. Nothing happens for a reason, to his well-known poem about the Titanic, The Convergence of the Twain, where he says everything about this was preordained by God. He doesn't use the term God. He has some great terms for God, like the spinner of the years and the imminent will and some stuff like that. But it seems godlike, and he has this idea that while people were building the ship, the Titanic, God was building the iceberg, and they were meant as two halves of one whole. Right? He calls them twin hemispheres, the iceberg and the boat. And there's, I think, something really profound about that idea, and it suggests an absolutely omnipotent God. So there's a range of ideas there too. And a lot of, I think, what he's trying to do, and when you read a lot of the poems together, you get the sense that he's just constantly searching. It's such a desire to believe and such an inability to believe. So one of the problems that Hardy always has is his eyes don't say what his brain wants to think. Wow. Or his eyes don't see what his heart wants to feel, something like that. So he's looking at the world and saying, I see suffering and I see misery and I see an absence of God, but I so want God to be there. And I think that that's the primary tension in the poems, really, is a desire for belief, but an inability fully to believe.
Right. At the time that I have to bring this up because it was actually one of my favorite poems and it's tied to this theme. Was I can't remember the title of the poem. I apologize, but the scenario was basically the perspective of someone dead in the grave.
That doesn't narrow it down, unfortunately.
And, right. It gets better. It gets better. And the digging. He senses the digging, and it's
called. Are you digging on my grave?
Are you digging on my grave? Yeah.
Right. It's that's a poem of great pathos.
And as a dog owner, and as an appreciator of these sort of I don't know what I'd call it, but these sort of
melodrama,
yeah, irony.
That one is, yeah.
That's essentially the beloved is imagining, or
it's a dead young woman.
A young woman is imagining that her beloved is pining over her and actually clawing at her grave, and it comes to the turn of the poem, and you finally realize that it's actually her dog, which might seem touching, but then you realize that the dog's just, I
buried a bone
here, and
Right. That was intense, for sure. Yeah. One of the things that Hardy also plays around with a lot is trying different perspectives and different voices. He's, we read a lot of poems, not just his, but many of his, and poems generally as autobiographical. But in fact, he really plays a lot with voice and persona and creating different characters. And that's one that's pretty obviously not him. But he's sort of imagining, what must this be like? And there's a real sort of condemnation in that poem of the living who don't sufficiently attend to their dead loved ones. Because as she's lying there saying, is that my beloved? And the speaker, who turns out to be the dog, but we don't know that at the time, says, no, he's gone and married another. And it's very condemning. Like, how could he? which is really interesting because, as I write in the book, I don't think that actually most of us would think that if someone died, the living person should never marry. And yet the poem suggests that it's an enormous betrayal to have done that.
Yeah.
And the family, right? Well, oh, are you my parents come to plant flowers or something? And then the dog says, no, they didn't see any point in that because it wouldn't bring you back again. Which again, I mean, Hardy would say, well, that's true, right? I mean, there's sort of an accuracy to that statement, but also the neglect is so painful.
Right.
Well, fine, are you my enemy? Come to mock me. No, the enemy doesn't even care about you anymore. Like, she's lost her hatred for you. It's like, even that is like, man. And then, oh, it's my dog, my beloved dog. At least you remember me. Because actually, I forgot you were here. I just buried a bone. So, right. So that one I think is a little over the top, but I think it does show the way that he uses narrative and to think about these different issues and his really unique take on ideas of life and death, and that actually fits in that poem very well with some of the later ones, like The Voice or The Haunted, that talk about how love can survive after death, right? And how the living partner is expected actually to continue to love the one who's gone. And so I think you see that actually throughout the poem.
Well, I'm really glad you brought that up because that raises a really huge question for me, and also one that I was happy to see you dealt with quite decisively in the biographical section of the text. And it's very tempting, and I admit I'm a historian and I read texts, and my Yetzer Hara, excuse the vernacular, is to read biography into text, right? I mean, I love to do that. In fact, it's my, it gives me joy, right? and you take a very specific position. It's very tempting to read Hardy, and I think it's a case for many of your more kind of somber, serious. You're sort of, I hate using adjectives to classify writers like this, but that you want to sort of fix it in some kind of life event. You want, and of course the death of Hardy's first wife, right, is often read as kind of a decisive moment for these type of works. So how about the question of biography as it relates to artistic production?
It's such an interesting question for me. In fact, my next book that I'm working on now, and that Gavi, who's here, helped me work on, is helping me work on. I have lots of student helpers.
I can see I need to start.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, some amazing students really do great work. And my next project is actually about how much you read biography into poetry and some of the pitfalls of doing so. It's interesting because this has sort of gone through various critical trends. Oh, Eitan's here too. He's helping me with it also. So various critical trends, and so there was a trend in the early part of the century, into the middle of the century, new criticism that said don't look at biography at all, don't consider biography, and then others like E.D. Hirsch who said our only goal as readers is to figure out exactly what the poet meant and really interpret it exactly the way the poet meant it. And then things like Stephen Greenblatt, more contemporary critics, who's a Renaissance scholar, but talks about biographical criticism as an important way to approach poetry. So I recognize that there's sort of a, moving set of trends attached to this, but I find just as a reader that it gets in the way. The biography can often get in the way. For Hardy, the number of times that he said in his life, why do they always assume that it's autobiographical? It drives me crazy. It's not autobiographical, suggests that we might want to heed that on some level. But I think even if a poet doesn't say it, we have to recognize, as I think we do or more easily do sometimes with novels, that just because something is written with an I doesn't mean it's the I of the poet, it's an eye of a speaker. Now, is the speaker in some way connected to the poet? Inevitably. Right? How could it be otherwise? The speaker is a creation of the poet, but that doesn't mean a perfect one-to-one correlation. And I think it's really problematic, actually, that because poetry is difficult, one of the things we often turn to as an easy fix is the biography. And so we say, I don't really understand the poem. Maybe the biography will give me some clue. And I just think we can do better than that. I think that actually what we need to do is figure out how to read poetry. And not say the biography is going to tell us something. The other problem for me with biography is that I think we often reduce it to its most salacious details.
Oh, for sure.
And so we don't really know, most readers, I think, don't really know Hardy's biography. What they know is he had a kind of troubled relationship with Emma, his first wife. She died. Immediately thereafter, he really regretted the troubled relationship, married his much younger secretary, Florence, and then spent his entire relationship with Florence completely ignoring her and pining for Emma. Right? So, I mean, I guess that's sort of an interesting story in a soap opera-y sort of way. But there's so much more to a person's life than that kind of superficial retelling of the gossipy details. And I think that when people find Emma in poems that don't expressly say Emma, I mean, could it be something about Hardy's relationship with Emma? Well, of course it could, but I think it's a work of his imagination. He was a novelist, for goodness sake. Do we think he was Jude? Do we think Emma was Tess? Like, it just doesn't have to be.
Right.
And so I think it's better to read the poems with that separation than to constantly read onto them this sort of diary entry, kind of approach. And I think what ends up happening, unfortunately, when we do that, is that we privilege the life of the person over the work that the person has created. And in fact, what's interesting about this particular person is the work he created, not his life. So I'd rather focus on the work. Anyway, these are ideas that I'm still working through, but I do feel really strongly that we turn to the biography too easily and insert it into the text too frequently.
Too readily.
Yeah, and I see it, in a number of critics, some of whom I cite in the book, who say things like, in this poem, he writes about Emma. It doesn't say Emma anywhere, right? In this poem, he writes about Emma and how they went to wherever, Hampshire, But in fact, he's misremembering because he and Emma never went to Hampshire. So it's like, well, then maybe he's not writing about Emma. So it's sort of an interesting thing that people almost can't get themselves out of imagining the I as him. Of course, what we have when we have poems like "Are you digging on my grave?" no one says that's really Hardy because it's so obviously not.
Right.
And so people, I think, a lot of critics sort of immediately exclude the poems that are obviously not Hardy, and any of them that could be him, they assume are him.
Right.
And I would say just because they could be doesn't mean they have to be.
Well, I think it's very interesting that you raised I guess I brought up the first time the "Are you digging on my grave?" because to me that was the most. If I were to pick a poem that seemed to reveal something about the character of the poet, that's the poem that. I mean, in a sense,
So
the sort of. It's almost a humor to it. I mean, I hate to say
I
it's
think
a dark humor, but there is a
humorous,
certain sort of humor to it that to me revealed something. At least I think, having never met Hardy, but it seemed to tell me something about him.
And I think that that's something that we want to be able to acknowledge, that it's not the poems that seem most autobiographical that are necessarily the ones where we're learning the most of import. And there are a number like that. Some of the war poems, he never fought in war, but he represents the experience of being a soldier in the Boer War, for instance, and also World War I. And I think you really get a tremendous insight into his worldview and to other ideas that he holds and to ways that he looks at humanity, even though those are very clearly poems that are not about his own personal experience.
Well, I have another question or two. I don't know what the format, when we want to open it up for audience. One more question, maybe?
Yeah.
One more? Okay. So, reading through the sort of critics' reception or often poor reception, actually, of the poetry, I came across this quotation, which I love mostly because it's Delmore Schwartz, who I hold in very high regard, where he says, Hardy says, so this is the Delmore Schwartz writing on Hardy, says, Hardy says with the greatest emphasis, you see, this is what life is.
Yeah.
Life is capitalized, I should say. And more than that, he says very often, you see, your old conception of what life is has been shown to be wrong and foolish by this example. And to me, it really captured sort of the, the kind of complexity of what's going on, at the same time as making a very grand statement about what's going on. Yeah. The critical response to Hardy has been a little bit fraught and a little bit hard to really sort of come around to a consensus on the nature of his importance. And I may get in trouble with this a little bit, but I would love to know, as a critic, what where you place him, what your assessment of Hardy's importance, and I don't want to like rate him on a scale of, but I would love to know where, there's a great deal of back and forth on the difficulty of dealing with the fact that he did not write in consistent, develop really a kind of consistent sort of
form,
use of
yeah.
form. What is your take?
So I guess it depends on your definition of important, right? Do you mean most influential? I'm not sure. I'm not sure that he's among the most influential of the 20th century poets because he wasn't doing the most innovative things, right? And it's very hard. He was seen at a time when people like Eliot and Pound were writing as an old man, right? A kind of washed up, Victorian novelist who happened to live till he's 90, so he got to write for a long time. But I think they really, he lived at the same time as that they did, and I think they saw him as an old man. He was a lot older than they were at the time, and they were writing as contemporaries, but I think it was very hard for people in that era to say, wait a minute, Hardy's doing something very modern and new, which I think he was. But he wasn't experimental with form, and so it didn't feel modern and new to people who were being very experimental, right? Who were publishing in blast. And so I don't think he was important, honestly, to the 20th century the way someone like Eliot was, or even Pound, who I consider a much lesser poet, if you just sort of line them up in terms of quality. Pound said, I think, more provocative things and maybe some more interesting things about theories, but the poetry itself, I don't think it holds up.
Right.
So I guess, but then do you mean important in terms of like how good he is? I think it's going to last. I do. And I think that probably, as with many poets, there'll be a resurgence again, and it'll probably go through some cycles. Larkin certainly helped to bring him back considerably, which was a very explicit goal of Larkin's. And because Larkin has been rated for many, many years now the #1 poet in Britain, even well after he has died, people still, I think a Guardian poll last year put him as the #1 favorite poet in England, Larkin, yeah. And so people still hold Hardy up because of the way Larkin held Hardy up. But I'm not sure that people fully appreciate him. I still think that people do say really depressed, old-fashioned. Like, I think a lot of those labels have stuck, even though I don't think the poetry warrants it.
Right. I would say I just want to throw this out there because I think it's just one of the great sort of comparisons or analogies you make in the text is in comparison with Eliot. Eliot as sort of the articulator of this idea of the unreal city, and Larkin perhaps as the Hardy of the unreal country, right? That there is this really palpable modernist sensibility.
I think there is, absolutely.
In this framework of really kind of folksy, kind of country sort of, which I think in a way is almost a, I don't know, subversive is the right word, kind of subversive modernism than the full frontal assault of someone like Eliot.
I think that's very well put. I think that's exactly what Hardy's doing, is sort of hiding what I think is a genuine modern ideal, a real modernism of thought behind sort of country expressions and old-fashioned language and very set forms, so much so that a lot of readers mistake those for, mimicking the content, as being equally old-fashioned, and it's not. And in many of the poems, as I talk about in the book, he's really upending older ideas. I mean, what he does to Wordsworth is just brutal.
Oh, right. Absolutely.
And, in very clever ways. And I think it's coming from the same modernist impulses that you see of the younger poets who were, his contemporaries on some level, but because it's not as in your face, it's often unrecognized. Like, there are a couple great articles about Hardy as modernist, but not nearly enough, I think. Yeah.
Well, I think it would probably be worthwhile to open up the discussion more broadly. Please.
So, Dr. Steinberg, which chapter was most enjoyable to write?
Ooh, that's a fun question. I was most into writing the one about the biography, actually. I'm very passionate about that topic. And I had to tone it down like so many times because I'm just really passionate about that topic. So I had a lot of fun writing about that and actually finding these examples of people who I think so falsely read the biography onto the poems. And then I had to take out a lot of those because it was getting kind of mean-spirited on my part. So I think that was really fun. In terms of the the different themes. I really enjoyed all of them in different ways. I think maybe writing about God, about Hardy's views of God, was maybe most interesting to me because it's a topic that I'm interested in, and so I really enjoyed delving into that, and then just reading those poems and having a chance to spend time with them. But they were all fun in their own ways. Yeah.
So I guess, how did Hardy's biography actually influence the chapter on God? 'Cause I know you wanted to draw a sharp distinction between his biography and his themes sometimes,
Yeah.
but I guess that might be...
I think it didn't. I don't think I read his biography there at all, really. It's hard to know what Hardy's sort of deeply held religious beliefs were, and I don't really want to use the poems to speculate on that. I don't think it's fair. If someone wants to talk about their deeply held religious beliefs in some nonfiction setting, I guess it's an option. But I don't think that writing poems about them, especially when the poems are so directly contradictory with one another, which is why I started by saying he's kind of throwing ideas out there, and to have one poem on the one hand that says everything is completely random chance, there is no God, and another poem that says God controls every tiny detail of the world. I mean, do you want to say then, well, he believed that on one day and that on the other day? Or, I think that what he's exploring is a lot of very real human reactions to what we see in the world and what we believe and what we want to believe. And I think he tries out different ones in different poems. So to the extent that that's a statement on his biography or his belief system, I guess. But I wouldn't want to guess at how he really felt consistently about religion. I don't think that I did bring that in.
So then why is it, do you think, that he... I guess I don't know enough of his poems to know, but that he was so resistant to use the word God and instead used all these different adjectives?
I think that it's because he felt that God was too simple an idea, and that these different terms, phrases, adjectives that he had were useful for specific attributes of God, right, or contexts of God. So the idea of the spinner of the years, which he uses at the end of that Titanic poem, and he says, and the spinner of the years said now, and consummation comes and jars two hemispheres. The idea there is very much a time-bound idea. So the aspect of God that he draws on in that terminology is about God as controlling time. Right? In other places, when he uses the imminent will, like in the Dynasts, it's very much about God as everywhere. It's imminent, right? Not imminent, about to happen. Right? So, this idea of a God who's everywhere and pervades all things, and so I think he's trying to actually pull apart the idea of God, and just putting in the word God probably isn't precise enough, right? I don't think it shows a lack of belief. Maybe it's an unconventional approach to belief, but I don't think it shows a consistent lack of belief to not say the word that really is, I think, even as religious people believe, a stand-in for something else, right? I mean, it's just a word.
So, this is a question, I guess, about Hardy's language in combination with his quirkiness, and maybe also about language and tone. It seems to me that he's willing to change the tone just in a line or stanza to stanza.
Yeah, sometimes he does,
so
right?
It'll be humorous, the dog comes into it. That's clearly dark humor, but it's humorous. Or some of the war poems have a good deal of humor.
A lot of humor,
in
absolutely.
them, in a kind of a bizarre way, and then they'll hit you with the seriousness, and just very quickly, it's like he's not at all interested in consistency or maintaining the reader's response. It's almost like he's willing to shock the reader line by line.
Yeah, I think there's some of that.
The diction is similar. If you take the Titanic and you have lines like, I may have these slightly wrong, but cold currents thrid, or salamandrine fires, or jars two hemispheres, things like that, where he's just he's playful, and he's the language is chewy, but it's also bizarre. There's something very sort of disturbingly quirky about it. So is that about his trying to shock the audience or keep them off kilter and uncomfortable, or is it a certain awkwardness where he's just not going to want to play it straight, or
That's interesting.
How do you read that?
So I think some critics read it as a kind of awkwardness. He's not adept at choosing words. And I don't actually think that's it at all. I think that he's really purposeful, and that actually a lot of what feels like awkwardness to us is something that he appreciated from country dialect that he wants to bring into his poetry, and suggest that that the ways, the manner of speech in country actually captures something that isn't captured by some other kind of language. So I think some of that, what feels like antiquated language, wasn't antiquated in Dorset, it just wasn't in the city anymore. And so I think that he wants to capture that because he feels that it has more nuance, right, than a sort of purified language that was being used in London. So I think at least there's that as part of it. But I agree with you about the catching the reader off guard a little bit, and I don't know if I'd say shock value so much as sort of willing to turn on a dime, right, and ask you to sort of go with him. And I think that the language does that too. Thinking about the oxen, I don't know if you know that poem, where he says, in the barton by yonder coombe, and he says that right at a moment which is very old-fashioned language, obviously, and he says that right at a moment that he's changing tone from talking about the faith in God that people have as children to the skepticism that they have as adults. And he uses that line as the turning point in the poem. Almost as an invocation of childhood, right, before moving on to no one would think this anymore, right? No one would have that kind of pure faith anymore. But I do think that there's a lot of that kind of playing with the reader.
Even when you turn away from biography in reading Hardy's poems, do you see themes and sentiments of his poems reflected in particular novels of his?
Oh, sure. Absolutely. I mean that the one that I said was that sort of overarching idea that everything's tilted towards the negative. I think you see very, very much in the novels. I mean, barely a happy thing happens, and if it does, it's like, uh-oh. that cannot be good. Yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of also the sense in the poems. Like, if anything good starts to happen, you should get really, really worried. Because there are a bunch of, in the ghost chapter, there are a bunch of poems where he says, like, we were so happy, we walked along the cliff holding hands, and you just think, oh, this is so bad. It's going to be so bad. Right? Exactly. So I think that's very true of the novels also. Human beings can't win. Right? And I think that's the thing that sort of carries through. And again, it feels so depressing. And then when you think about it, I think from Hardy's perspective, there's a level on which it's true. If you think about mortality in the way that he does, right? Human beings can't win. They can't overcome that, at least. And so I think that that's sort of what he notices, and an idea that keeps coming back again and again. Other things I think are less consistent. He's less consistent about his attitudes towards war, for instance. Death, obviously, is always there, and it's hard to avoid that in poems about war. But what it means, I think it's not very consistent. His poems about love, too, I think that there are a lot of different kinds of emotions. Often regret, often a sense that the love wasn't deep enough at the time, and now it's too late, right? There's a lot of sense of regret that carries through. There's a lot in the novels, I think, and in the poems about fearing old age and about not wanting to be old. But one of them that I really love, called I Look Into My Glass, actually doesn't so much regret being old as feeling young inside. And so what he asks for, and it's so interesting because it's a poem that was written in the same year that The Picture of Dorian Gray was written. And what he asks for is not to be young, but to have his insides feel as old as his outsides. There's something to me, so poignant and beautiful about that, about he just wants to match, right? Because it's so hard to have a young heart in an old body. So you'd think that he would go Dorian and say, so I'd like to have a young body. And instead he says, just give me an old heart, right? And so I think, there's some really poignant, sort of thoughtful ideas that I think you do see carried across. But the primary one, and the thing that sort of overarches everything, is just this tilt towards the inevitable.
I was curious about the role that many of these guys played in the process. I want
Well,
to hear
so
more
okay,
about that.
so Gavi and Eitan are helping me with the next one. So they didn't really do this, but Chesky, I think you worked on the God chapter,
God
right?
chapter.
Yeah. So what I did, I had luck from the Chelst grant. I had money to hire some undergraduates, and also through the provost's office. And so I had 4 students working with me. And what we decided to do when we all got together early on was split up the chapters. So I had already written drafts of everything, and then gave each of them a chapter. So Chesky was working on the God chapter, and Daniel Goldberg was working on the chapter about death, and R.L. Kirstein worked on the one about war, and Dov Honig was helping me with the one about narrative and the connections to prose writing. So each of them took a chapter, and I gave them some ideas of things to look for, and ways to help me with reading. And Chesky found some really interesting sources that I ended up, some of them, incorporating into the chapter. And we sort of went back and forth, and I sent them questions, and find this article and see if it seems relevant, and that kind of stuff. So it was great, and I think just as a writer, it's always so useful to have readers. And so, even with things where they weren't familiar with the topic exactly, they were able to say, I don't really understand this. And with a book like this, especially, that is written for a more generalist audience, I think it's great to have readers who are students of poetry and, students of literature who can say, this doesn't make sense to me, it has to be clearer. Because in some ways, advanced undergraduates are part of the audience that I'm working for here. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it was also, it's hard to be isolated in your writing all the time. So writing a book is kind of an isolating event, and having anyone who's willing to talk to you about it, and I think I abused my husband's patience with this. So I'd be like, I have to talk about Hardy one more time. So it's nice to have students who are involved in that and feel invested in it.
So you just mentioned something about audience. How conscious do you think Hardy was when he wrote of his audience? And
That's a great question.
Was did he have an intended audience? Yeah. Was it mass appeal, his poetry, or was it?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think that he was aiming for a mass appeal, absolutely. And this was, of course, a time, you have to keep in mind, when poetry was much more widely read than it is now. So people would actually go out and buy volumes of poetry. Now that's relatively unusual. Even the best-selling poets now sell in the, tens of thousands. So I think he was aiming for mass readership, and his volumes were reviewed in very prominent, newspapers and magazines. I think he was probably a little bit more conscious of audience with the novels, in part because he needed those for income in a way that he did not any longer need the poems for income. So they had to be saleable, and that meant also targeting them towards particular publications. So I think he was very conscious of that, as serial novelists had to be. And I think by the time he was a poet, he was already so well established that he could kind of do his own thing. But that doesn't mean that he wasn't conscious of audience, and he certainly wanted to be loved. I mean, that was true to the very end. And in fact, we didn't talk about this, but a really interesting part of the biography is that he wrote his own biography on some level, and didn't call it an autobiography, pretended that it was written by Florence. He wrote what's been discovered is that he wrote the pages, gave them to her, and asked her to type them, and then destroy his written ones so that no one would know. So it's like a pretty profound attempt at controlling image. It's really complicated, too, because then she would type them up and give them back to him, and he would make comments, and she would pretend that she had made the comments. And also, J.M. Barrie, the author of Peter Pan, was very involved in this whole process. He also was typing the pages and making emendations that Hardy was accepting or rejecting. And the biography wasn't published until after his death, and was treated as an authorized biography for a couple decades before scholars actually uncovered some of these pages that hadn't been destroyed and realized that he'd written most of it himself. And now there are these versions where you can actually see in the notes, it's been taken apart, like which parts did he write, which parts did she write, this kind of stuff. So, he had a deep, profound care about what people thought.
So I'm going to have to change the syllabus of my autobiography course now.
Right.
'Cause
It's a great story. It is a great story. It's really interesting, yeah.
Do you think there's something about certain writers that attract biographical readings? it doesn't seem like it's a clean split of poetry to prose. You could look at Fitzgerald and Hemingway, and they can't get out of there either. So
Interesting. Yeah. So I think that it's maybe some writers who have sort of interesting lives, or feel like what feels like interesting lives. We want to find out more about those. So it may be that. I think. Hemingway, I think there's always more of an attraction to anyone who's committed suicide, unfortunately. Fitzgerald, pretty troubled, the drinking. I think people like that kind of detail. I mean, I have to say, I think it's very much like a gossip magazine, like, what is it, TMZ, like that sort of thing.
It feels like it might be a modernist sort of invention also. Maybe
well, it partially is because there's so much more information available now. I mean, if you wanted to do that about Chaucer, you couldn't.
Right.
There's just not enough known. I mean, we know some things, but not enough to sort of go through the day-to-day. But now we have, what did he have for breakfast before he wrote this poem, and then what did he do in the afternoon? Like, you can trace it so carefully, and I think that is part of what allows us to go that direction, and so when we're allowed to, we do. I'd have to think more about why certain ones and not others. But I do have this sense that it's more often poets than novelists. I'm not sure that's totally true, but it feels like that to me. It feels like we're willing to, read certain novels and say the eye of this is not the author, in a way that we assume that the eye of a poem is a poet. I don't know.
Because of the shortness, right? I mean.
Well, also I just think because of
certain. In what state of mind was this particular day? Someone who wrote a novel through 3 years, and you can look at the poem and say, well, perhaps. What was happening this particular week when he wrote?
That might be. It might be the shortness. I think also we just have a sense about poetry as being this kind of confession of the heart. I see that from my students all the time. Like, they would never say, I'm going to write a short story, but like, my girlfriend broke up with me, I wrote a poem, will you read it? Is a pretty constant refrain for me. And so I think that there's a sense that poetry is very personal, and that when people want to write something personal, they immediately turn to poetry. And that stories can be about other characters, there's more freedom to create other characters. I don't think that that's actually accurate in poetry. I just think that there's a sense about poetry that it's almost like a diary entry in verse. I just think that people believe that about poetry. Or at least contemporaries do. No one thinks that. Well, I don't think people thought that in Chaucer's time in the same way.
Well, it's more elusive, finding meaning behind a poem can be such a challenge
it's harder,
that you want to
attach it to something.
To whatever you can.
I think that's really true.
Although,
I think
incidentally,
poetry
if
is
you
hard.
do find what Chaucer ate for breakfast, I would recommend publishing immediately.
Yeah, I think it is the fact that poetry feels slipperier, and so it's hard to get a handle on, and so we look to something that feels more concrete so that we can attach it. And that may actually be true, at least for Hemingway, because that's a little hard to get a handle on, too. Like, what's going on in there? I don't know. Let's find out what he was doing that day. Right? So maybe it's just a tendency to turn to something that feels more concrete, or like an anchor.
Well, in a novel, you have usually a lot more details about the character who's speaking. So,
I don't know. I think that there are poems where there's just a lot of richness about who the character is and how much you can find out. Even relatively short poems. I'm thinking of Larkin's Church Going. It just says so much about who that person is and how he changes and how he's lying to his audience at the beginning, and a clearer sense of his character comes out by the end. And it's like, 7 stanzas or something, and yet people so much assume that it's Larkin that you almost miss the beauty of the poem. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Paul, you wanted to say something about this. Do you know the answer to this one?
I do not.
Oh, okay. Were you going to ask a question? I just saw your hand up. I thought you wanted to answer. Oh, okay. Oh, yeah. So I'm not sure. I'm not exactly sure, but it's what I'm thinking about now, and it's something that's very interesting to me. And it's not unique to poetry. I mean, I think that there's a lot of that, say, surrounding Van Gogh. Right. Again, I think because there's this detail that we know about him, and we want to see it in the paintings. So you stand in front of Starry Night and say, like, can I see the ear? It's like, there's something crazy. I want to see the crazy. And I think, unfortunately, that ruins the experience of looking at the painting, for me, at least, or takes away the purity of the possibility of the experience of looking at the painting, because we're looking to find this thing in it. But I think it's because it's hard to look at paintings well. So,
Well, it's something shared by poetry. I mean, the aesthetic experience of poetry is, I would say, arguably similar to the visual of looking at a painting. I mean, that you're forced to confront a reality that is outside your own, that is oftentimes hidden behind a symbolic meaning that you can't necessarily decipher.
Absolutely.
You may never be able to decipher.
And it's hard to articulate.
And it's hard to articulate, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But since nothing is really created in a vacuum, do you think that there's a danger of scholars reducing the lives of the artists to their work?
I don't see that necessarily as a danger, because it seems to me that we're studying the artists because of their work.
Okay.
So if one's study is the life of the artist, then by all means, go for it. Study the life of the artist. Biography is a perfectly legitimate field of study. My concern is when we say we're studying the poems, and instead we're studying the life of the artist. So I actually don't mind studying the life of the artist if the life of the artist is worth a study. I have no objection to that at all. It's not what I do, but I think if we're saying that we're studying the texts, then that should be our primary focus. And I think that something is lost in the study of the texts when we say we're studying the text, but we're actually studying the life of the artist, because it's not honest. I don't know how interesting Hardy's life is outside of the fact that he created some amazing writing. I don't know that it would be something I'd want to spend my time studying. I'm interested in the writing. There are people whose lives are absolutely fascinating. I'm not convinced that Hardy's one of them. But his writing is fascinating, right? And so I just wouldn't want the details of his life to be the only thing I can find when I read the poems. And if we attach those details to, too much as a one-to-one correspondence, he wrote this 1 week after Emma died, and therefore he was feeling this in the process of his grieving. Like, this stuff exists. I'm not making this up. Then I think that we lose some of the writing. Now, do we want to also acknowledge that he was grieving at the time he wrote the poem? That's fine, right? It's a poem written in grief. But to try to find a perfect correspondence to the details of the life, or to say, this isn't the creation of a character, this is Hardy writing about Emma, I think that's reductionist. Norm?
I'm sorry, I've heard some of your other talks. Is it a legitimate field, let's say one were a scientist or a neuroscientist, and you weren't interested in studying how light affects the eye, but you had higher ambitions, you wanted to study the brain or the mind, and you decided to study the most interesting things in the world, beauty, and you chose to study somebody who produced beauty by the consensus of a community. So you wanted to study the brain of Thomas Hardy, or better yet, someone like James Joyce. Would it then be legitimate to focus on the brain of James Joyce, or Alice Waters, or I'll get a better one, or Shalom Aleichem?
I don't understand the question, Norm. I'm sorry. I don't really understand the question.
Would it be then legitimate to study the artist or a particular person and his or her brain in order to understand the piece of literature? You call it reductionism, some would say.
To study the brain in order to understand the
mind,
literature?
Or that person. Let's say, would it then be legitimate to study that person in order to understand the piece of literature, if one could? You said it's okay to study an individual's life. You're not interested in it. You're interested in studying a work of art. If Thomas Hardy were alive today, would it be a legitimate thing not only to study his life, but his brain, his mind, his neurons?
As a neuroscientist?
Call me what you want. Yeah.
Sure.
That's okay. Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Well, I think we've got a lot to think about. I want to say thank you to you and for giving me the opportunity to be able to talk to you about this. Absolutely.
Thanks for the great
loved
questions.
it, and it's really turned me on to Hardy. I can tell you, the poetry is absolutely outstanding.
Great.
Are you
Thank
selling
all.
books, Gillian?
I have a few extra if people want them. Yeah, sure.
Do you take credit cards?
I cannot take credit cards. I'm sorry.
How
But
come?
I don't have a credit card reader. I mean, I could take your credit card.